Lisa was supposed to be my anchor, my sister by choice. Instead, she became the storm that shattered everything I thought I knew about loyalty. I'm Emma, and for as long as I can remember, Lisa and I were inseparable, two halves of the same whole, navigating life's ups and downs side by side. From late-night talks about dreams we dared to whisper only to each other, to planning our futures with the naive certainty that nothing could come between us. But that illusion was ripped apart the moment I discovered the truth. It started quietly enough. A casual conversation over coffee, where I confided in Lisa about a job opportunity that felt like a lifeline. The position was rare, highly competitive, and exactly the break I needed to push my career forward. I trusted her implicitly when I told her I was applying, shared every detail, the company, the role, the interview process. In those moments, she smiled and nodded, encouraging me, promising to be my biggest cheerleader. I believed her. Weeks later, the ground beneath me crumbled. The call came on a dreary Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs heavy and the world seems to slow. I was at my desk, nervously refreshing my email, waiting for any news. Instead, I got a message from a mutual acquaintance. Lisa had taken the job, not just applied, but secured it. The very position I had poured my hopes into. My breath hitched, confusion twisting into disbelief. I stared at the words like they were a cruel joke, but the truth stung sharper than any punchline. I confronted Lisa that evening, my voice trembling with a mix of hurt and rage. "How could you? I told you everything, Lisa. I trusted you." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, a quick flash of guilt or defiance. I couldn't tell. "Emma, it's just business," she said, the words cold and detached. I needed this more than you did. The betrayal in that sentence was a blade to my heart. I remember the silence that followed, the room closing in around us. The friendship I'd held sacred was unraveling, thread by fragile thread. Lisa's ambition had blinded her to our bond, and suddenly I was nothing more than an obstacle in her path. The realization hit harder than the loss of the job itself. It was the fracture of trust, the betrayal by someone I considered family. Days passed in a blur of numbness and quiet anger. I found myself withdrawing, retreating into a shell where I replayed every conversation, every smile, every moment that now felt tainted. Friends noticed the change, my usual warmth replaced by a distant chill. I questioned everything, my judgment, my worth, my ability to see people for who they really are. The wound was deeper than I could have imagined. It was a betrayal of the soul. One night, alone in my apartment, the weight of it all pressed down like a suffocating fog. I sat by the window, watching the city lights blur in the rain, wondering how someone so close could turn so cold. The pain was raw, but beneath it simmered a quiet fire. I refused to be defined by this moment. Lisa had taken a piece of me, yes, but she hadn't taken my spirit. That evening marked a turning point, though I didn't know it yet. The betrayal was a fracture, but it was also a crack through which a new version of me would emerge. I didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I would rise. Not out of spite, but because I owed it to myself. For now, though, I was left with the sting of loss and a silence that screamed louder than any words. Lisa's betrayal was the beginning of a journey neither of us could have predicted, one that would test the limits of friendship, ambition, and the meaning of trust. And as the city pulsed outside my window, I made a silent vow this was not the end of my story. It was only the first painful chapter. The days after Lisa took that job felt like I was walking through a fog so thick I could barely see my own hands. The sharp edge of betrayal had settled deep inside me, dragging me down into a pit of confusion and hurt. It wasn't just the loss of the position, it was the shattering of something far more precious. Trust. Friendship, the faith I'd placed in someone who was supposed to have my back. I kept turning it over in my mind, like a twisted puzzle I couldn't solve. How had I been so blind? How had Lisa's ambition blinded her so completely that she'd step over me without a second thought? The question haunted every moment, every quiet second between the chaos of my thoughts. The sting wasn't just in what she'd done, it was in the realization that the person I thought I knew was someone else entirely. I withdrew from the world little by little. The calls from friends went unanswered. Messages sat unopened on my phone. At work, I became quieter, less engaged, my usual spark dulled by the weight of what had happened. I found myself questioning my own judgment, doubting my ability to read people, to trust again. The betrayal wasn't just a wound, it was a mirror reflecting a part of myself I didn't want to face. Nights were the worst. Alone in my apartment, the silence was deafening. I'd lie awake, the ceiling above me, a blank canvas for all the scenarios replaying in my mind. I pictured the smile Lisa wore when she told me, "It's just business," the coldness behind those words. It wasn't just a job to her, it was a victory at my expense. The thought made my chest tighten, a mix of anger and sorrow swirling inside me. Friends tried to reach out, but I kept them at arm's length. Their well-meaning words felt hollow, unable to bridge the gap that had opened between me and the person I trusted most. Even my family noticed the change, the way I shut down, how I no longer shared my hopes and fears like I used to. The betrayal wasn't something I could explain easily. It was a private wound that bled beneath the surface. Everywhere I looked, reminders of what I'd lost stared back at me. The coffee shop where Lisa and I planned our futures, the park bench where we dreamed aloud about better days, the countless messages exchanged late into the night. Those memories, once warm and comforting, now felt like shards of glass cutting through the fabric of my heart. I found myself questioning everything, not just Lisa, but myself. Had I been naive? Too trusting? Was I too soft in a world that rewarded ruthlessness? The pain was a bitter teacher, forcing me to confront uncomfortable truths about people and about myself. I realized that ambition could be a double-edged sword, capable of driving success but also destroying bonds. But beneath the hurt, beneath the doubt, something else began to stir. A small spark of clarity amidst the chaos. I saw that this wasn't just a story about betrayal, it was a test of resilience. Lisa's choice to put herself first had broken my trust, yes, but it hadn't broken me. The wound was raw, but it was also a call to awaken, to find strength I hadn't known I possessed. Slowly, I started to piece together my shattered confidence. I reminded myself of who I was before this all happened, a woman with dreams, with talent, with a fierce determination that had carried me this far. The loss of a job, even one I wanted desperately, could not define me. The pain could be a catalyst, not a cage. In quiet moments, I found myself thinking about the future again. Not the future I'd imagined with Lisa by my side, but one I would build on my own terms. The betrayal had left a scar, but it also left an opening, a chance to rewrite my story. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. One evening, as I sat at my desk staring at a blank page on my laptop, I realized something important. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer a wall between me and the world. It was a bridge, a painful, fragile bridge, but one that led somewhere new. I could choose to stay trapped in bitterness, or I could choose to move forward. I didn't have all the answers yet, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time since Lisa's betrayal, I felt a flicker of hope. I was beginning to understand that the deepest wounds often hold the seeds of growth. The betrayal had broken something precious, but it had also forced me to see the truth about Lisa, about ambition, and most importantly, about myself. The nights remained long and the silence sometimes unbearable, but I was no longer alone in my pain. I was learning to face it, to let it fuel me instead of consuming me. The friendship I'd lost was a chapter closed, but my story was far from over. And as the city lights flickered beyond my window, I made a quiet promise. I would find my way through this darkness, stronger and wiser than before. The sting of Lisa's betrayal lingered like a shadow, but somewhere beneath the weight of it all, I found a flicker of determination that refused to be extinguished. I realized that if I let this define me, I'd lose more than just a job, I'd lose myself. So I made a choice. I wouldn't let bitterness consume me, I would rise. Not for revenge, not to prove her wrong, but because I owed myself a future unshackled by this pain. The first step was admitting I needed to grow, to become more than I was before. I started pouring every ounce of energy into developing my skills, sharpening the very tools Lisa had underestimated. Nights once spent brooding were now filled with online courses, late-night readings, and relentless practice. I devoured books on leadership, communication, and strategy. The hunger inside me wasn't just for knowledge, it was for reclaiming control over my life. Networking became my new battlefield. I pushed myself out of the comfort zone I'd retreated into, attending industry events, seminars, and informal meetups. Each handshake, each conversation was a brick in the foundation of a new career path that no one could sabotage. I was learning to present myself not as the woman left behind, but as someone ready to lead, to innovate, to succeed on her own terms. The shift wasn't easy. Doubt crept in more times than I cared to admit. There were moments I questioned if the effort was worth it, if the wound would ever truly heal. But every time I teetered on the edge of surrender, I reminded myself of what had brought me here, the betrayal that cut deep but didn't kill my spirit. I was transforming pain into purpose, weakness into strength. Friends noticed the change too. Slowly, I began reopening lines of communication, not to dwell on the past, but to rebuild connections that had frayed under the weight of my silence. Their encouragement fueled me, reminding me I wasn't alone in this. Some were surprised by my resolve, others inspired. But most importantly, I was rediscovering the version of myself that had been buried beneath shock and hurt. I stopped waiting for Lisa to realize what she'd lost, or to seek forgiveness. That chapter was closed, her ambition had shown its true colors, and I was no longer willing to let it poison my future. My focus was on the path ahead, on creating opportunities not just for survival, but for triumph. With every new skill mastered and every connection made, I felt the walls I'd built around my heart begin to crumble. I was no longer the betrayed friend, clinging to hope for reconciliation. I was becoming a woman poised to surpass expectations, including my own. The turning point came unexpectedly during a project at work. I volunteered to lead a challenging assignment that others shied away from, a chance to prove my capabilities in a tangible way. The pressure was immense, but so was my determination. Late nights turned into early mornings. I coordinated teams, navigated obstacles, and delivered results that impressed even the toughest critics. That success was a spark. It ignited a fire I hadn't known I possessed. I realized that my worth wasn't tied to the job Lisa took or the friendship she broke. It was inherent, built on resilience, hard work, and a refusal to be defined by betrayal. Every email I sent, every presentation I gave, carried a silent declaration. I am not the woman you left behind. I am the woman who will rise above. The journey wasn't without its moments of loneliness. I faced setbacks, doubts, and the occasional pang of bitterness. But I met each challenge with renewed focus, knowing that this was my story to write. I began setting clear goals, concrete milestones that pushed me forward. Each achievement, no matter how small, was a victory over the past. I tracked progress meticulously, celebrating growth and learning from mistakes. This wasn't just about career advancement, it was about reclaiming my identity and rewriting the narrative. As weeks turned into months, the transformation was undeniable. I was no longer the person who'd been blindsided by betrayal. I was someone who had harnessed that pain, reshaped it, and used it as fuel for a new beginning. The bitterness faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that radiated from within. Lisa's name crossed my mind less frequently. The wound was healing, and in its place grew a resolve that no one could take away. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was building something better. One evening, as I reviewed my updated resume and polished portfolio, I felt a surge of pride. The journey from heartbreak to hope wasn't over yet, but I was ready for whatever came next. The woman I was becoming was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. I knew the path ahead would be challenging, but I embraced it with open arms. The betrayal had been a painful lesson, but it was also a catalyst that propelled me toward a future I was ready to claim. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Sometimes, the deepest wounds open the door to the greatest growth. Lisa's call came out of the blue, a sudden ripple in the calm I'd worked so hard to build. I hadn't heard from her since the fallout, and part of me wondered why she was reaching out now. When I answered, the hesitation in her voice was unmistakable. "Emma, can we talk? I want to explain. And maybe ask for forgiveness." I listened, cool and measured, as she stumbled through her justifications. "It wasn't personal," she said. "I needed that job more than you did. I thought I was doing what was best for myself." The words felt hollow, rehearsed. I recognized the attempt to soften the blow, to mend fences, but I wasn't ready to open that door. "Not yet. I'm sorry it hurt you," she added, her voice almost pleading. But the damage was done. I kept my tone steady, careful not to let anger or bitterness seep in. "Lisa, it's not about the apology, it's about trust. That's something you broke. I'm not sure it's something that can be fixed easily." She was silent after that, and I knew this conversation was as much for her as it was for me. I didn't hang up angry, but I didn't offer comfort either. The friendship that once felt unbreakable was now a fragile thread, stretched thin and frayed. Meanwhile, life outside that strained conversation was shifting beneath my feet. A week later, I landed a key role at a rival company, a position I'd fought hard for, one that recognized my skills and potential. The irony wasn't lost on me. The job Lisa had taken was now being overshadowed by the path I was carving for myself. The tension between what was lost and what was gained was palpable. On my first day, I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The new team welcomed me warmly, and I quickly immersed myself in projects that challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just another employee. I was a force, determined to prove that the betrayal wouldn't define me. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and late nights. I poured myself into the work, channeling every ounce of frustration and determination into results. The leadership took notice not just of my output, but of my attitude. Calm, collected, and unshakable, I began to build a reputation that contrasted sharply with the bitterness I'd once felt. Lisa's messages became more frequent during this time. Tentative check-ins, veiled apologies, attempts to reconnect. I read them with guarded eyes, aware that reopening old wounds could jeopardize the progress I was making. The temptation to respond softened the edges of my resolve, but I held firm. Forgiveness wasn't off the table, but it wouldn't come at the cost of my own peace. At company events, I found myself face-to-face with colleagues who knew Lisa. Whispers followed me, some expressing surprise at my resilience, others casting doubt. But I let the murmurs wash over me, refusing to engage. The real victory was in the work I produced, the respect I earned through grit and grace. One afternoon, during a high-stakes presentation to the board, I felt the weight of the moment. Hours of preparation culminated in a seamless delivery that earned nods and questions, not criticism. As I left the room, a colleague slipped me a note. "You're going places, Emma." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. The contrast between my rising trajectory and Lisa's faltering grip on her role was undeniable. Rumors of struggles and missteps reached my ears, but I kept my focus inward. This wasn't about gloating. It was about reclaiming my narrative and building something lasting. The tension simmered beneath the surface, a quiet reminder of the past, but no longer a chain binding me. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed aside. I was a contender, poised to surpass not just Lisa's achievements, but my own expectations. Late one evening, I found myself reflecting on the journey from betrayal and heartbreak to this moment of burgeoning success. The road had been rocky, fraught with doubt and pain, but also illuminated by moments of clarity and strength. I realized that while Lisa's actions had set the wheels in motion, it was my response that shaped the outcome. In the silence of my apartment, I made a promise to myself to keep pushing forward, to remain true to the principles that defined me, and to never let anyone else's ambition dim my light. The story wasn't over, but I was writing the next chapter on my own terms, with resilience as my pen and determination as my ink. The promotion came like a quiet thunderclap, unexpected, yet inevitable. Sitting across the sleek conference table, I listened as the CEO outlined the new executive structure, my name woven seamlessly into the fabric of leadership. It was surreal. Months ago, I was grappling with betrayal and doubt. Now, I was being entrusted with a role that held real influence, real power. When I accepted the title of vice president, a wave of emotions crashed over me: pride, relief, and a steely resolve. I wasn't just climbing a ladder, I was reshaping the landscape, including the one Lisa inhabited. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now an executive at the very company where she worked, a position that shifted the balance between us in ways neither of us could have predicted. Walking through the halls, I sensed the undercurrent of whispers, some admiring, others skeptical. But I held my head high, knowing that my ascent was built on merit, on relentless effort, not shortcuts or betrayals. The boardroom became my arena, a place where I could steer strategy and culture, imprinting my vision on the company's future. Lisa's presence in the building was a constant reminder of the past, but it no longer unsettled me. Our interactions were brief, professional, and tinged with an unspoken tension. I could see the unease behind her composed facade, a subtle shift in the dynamics that once defined us. The tables had turned, and with that reversal came a quiet satisfaction. Leading my team, I emphasized collaboration and integrity, values I held dear after the lessons learned. The scars from betrayal fueled my commitment to fostering an environment where trust wasn't just a word, but a lived experience. I became a mentor to those navigating the choppy waters of ambition and loyalty, offering guidance drawn from hard-earned wisdom. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it was also invigorating. Each decision I made rippled through the company, shaping projects and people alike. I relished the challenge, knowing that this was more than a personal victory. It was an opportunity to create lasting impact. Meanwhile, Lisa's struggles became more apparent. Rumors of missed deadlines and strained relationships circulated quietly. I watched from a distance as she grappled with the consequences of choices that once seemed so calculated. There was no satisfaction in her faltering, only a recognition that ambition without integrity was a fragile foundation. Our once shared path had diverged sharply. While Lisa's trajectory wavered, mine soared steadily upward. The contrast was stark, a living testament to the power of resilience and character. I carried no malice, only a calm confidence born from overcoming betrayal and transforming pain into purpose. At company events, I took note of the shifting perceptions. Colleagues who once doubted me now sought my counsel. Recognizing the strength and clarity I brought to the table, I embraced the role of leader not just in title, but in action, setting an example that transcended office politics and personal history. One evening, after a particularly successful presentation to stakeholders, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The betrayal, the doubt, the relentless work, it all led to this moment of quiet triumph. I realized that power wasn't just about position, it was about the ability to rise above past wounds and lead with integrity. Lisa's uneasy glances in meetings were no longer intimidating. They were reminders of the choices that had shaped us both. I felt no desire to gloat or confront. Instead, I focused on building bridges where I could and setting firm boundaries where I couldn't. The dynamic between us was a delicate dance of past and present, but I refused to let it define my future. In private moments, I thought about the woman I'd become, stronger, wiser, unshaken by betrayal. The promotion was a milestone, but it was also a beginning. With each new challenge, I was writing a story not of revenge, but of redemption and growth. As the city lights flickered beyond my office window, I made a silent vow to lead with the grace and strength I had cultivated. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready. The power shift was complete, and with it came a profound sense of purpose that no setback could diminish. Sitting behind the polished desk that now bore my nameplate as CEO, I felt the weight of both victory and responsibility settle over me like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just about personal triumph anymore. It was about shaping a future that honored the lessons etched into my journey. Lessons born from betrayal, resilience, and unwavering determination. The company was no longer just a place where I climbed the ranks. It had become a platform to influence change, to foster an environment rooted in trust and respect. I made it my mission to lead with transparency and empathy, ensuring that no one within these walls would have to endure the kind of betrayal that once threatened to break me. Lisa's name lingered in the corridors, less as a presence and more as a cautionary tale. Her earlier choices had left ripples that continued to affect her standing. As I observed from my vantage point, it was clear that ambition without integrity was a brittle foundation. Her role diminished, her influence waned, and the respect she once commanded eroded quietly under the weight of her own missteps. Yet, I refrained from reveling in her fall. My focus was forward, not backward. I channeled my energy into mentoring others, especially women who had faced similar betrayals or setbacks. I understood the sting of broken trust and the struggle to reclaim one's path. Through workshops, one-on-one coaching, and company initiatives, I worked to create a culture where voices were heard and silenced talents found their stage. The boardroom became a place of innovation and inclusivity where ideas flourished regardless of hierarchy or tenure. I pushed for policies that promoted fairness and accountability, determined to dismantle the subtle barriers that often held back those with potential. The company's growth was no longer just measured in profits, but in the empowerment of its people. Behind closed doors, I navigated the complexities of leadership with a steadiness born from hard-won experience. The scars of betrayal had transformed into badges of wisdom, guiding my decisions with a mix of caution and courage. I learned to listen more, to trust my instincts, and to build alliances grounded in mutual respect rather than convenience. Lisa's attempts to reconnect had dwindled to silence. The fracture between us was a chasm I no longer sought to bridge. Her presence was a reminder of past wounds, but it did not define the present. In fact, her distance underscored the stark contrast between a leadership rooted in integrity and one marred by self-interest. The company thrived under this new vision. Employee engagement soared, innovation accelerated, and the brand's reputation blossomed. I took pride not just in these metrics, but in the stories of individuals whose careers had been revitalized, whose voices had been amplified because someone finally chose to listen. One afternoon, a young woman approached me after a seminar, eyes shining with gratitude. "You don't know how much your story means to me," she said. "I've faced betrayal, doubt, and I thought I was alone. But seeing you rise, it gives me hope." Her words struck a chord deep within me. This was the real victory, the ability to inspire, to uplift, to transform pain into purpose beyond myself. As the sun set beyond the city skyline, casting a warm glow through my office window, I reflected on the journey from shattered trust to empowered leadership. The path had been anything but easy, marked by setbacks and silent battles. But each challenge had forged a stronger, wiser version of me. I was no longer the woman betrayed by a friend's ambition. I was a leader who had turned that betrayal into a beacon of strength for others. The power I held was not just in title, but in the responsibility and opportunity to make a difference. The road ahead remained filled with challenges, but I faced it with a heart unburdened by past wounds and a spirit fueled by hope. The company's future was bright, illuminated by the shared commitment to trust, respect, and growth. And in that moment, I knew that my journey, once fractured by betrayal, had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of forgiveness, not for others, but for myself. The betrayal that once threatened to unravel me had become the soil from which I'd grown into the woman I was now. Sitting in my office, sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting golden patterns on the floor, I often found myself reflecting on the journey, a path marked by pain, resilience, and ultimately, transformation. I used to carry the weight of that heartbreak like a wound that refused to heal. But time and distance had softened the edges, revealing something unexpected. The betrayal was not the end of my story, but its beginning. It became the catalyst that pushed me to rise beyond the hurt, to forge a new identity defined not by loss, but by strength and achievement. Looking around at the life I'd built, the company thriving under my leadership, the team I mentored, the culture of trust I fostered, I felt a quiet pride. This was my victory, not over Lisa or anyone else, but over the fear and doubt that had once threatened to consume me. I was no longer a victim of circumstance, I was the architect of my future. The scars remained, subtle reminders of where I'd been, but they no longer dictated my path. Instead, they were badges of experience, proof of survival and growth. I had learned that betrayal, while painful, could be a powerful teacher, if only you were willing to listen. I embraced my role with a fierce determination to help others who faced similar shadows. Through mentorship programs and speaking engagements, I shared my story not as a tale of vengeance, but as a beacon of hope. I wanted women silenced by betrayal or sidelined by circumstance to know they could reclaim their narratives and rise stronger. Sometimes, whispers reached me of Lisa's struggles, her career faltering, her influence waning. I felt no triumph in those tidings, only a bittersweet acknowledgement that choices have consequences. Our paths had diverged irrevocably, and I had no desire to dwell in the past. My focus was forward, on the endless possibilities before me. Friends and colleagues often remarked on the transformation. They witnessed the quiet confidence, the grace under pressure, the unwavering integrity. I knew that beneath it all was a woman who had refused to be defined by betrayal, who had chosen growth over bitterness, courage over fear. One afternoon, as I packed the last box of memories from a chapter closed, I whispered a silent thanks to the pain that had awakened me, to the lessons that had shaped me, and to the resilience that carried me through. I stepped out into the city streets, the hum of life around me, a reminder that every ending is also a beginning. The future stretched wide before me, uncharted and full of promise. I was ready to embrace it with open arms and an open heart. The betrayal that once threatened to break me had instead set me free. And as I walked toward the horizon, I carried with me the unshakable truth that true revenge is not in destruction, but in the freedom to live beyond the pain, thriving, empowered, and unapologetically myself. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.